For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 2, Episode 46 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
We're constantly learning about the pathogenesis of this disease and how it fits into the bigger picture of metabolic health in general. And to me, they're so inextricably linked. Liver fat, visceral fat, hepatocyte damage, hepatocellular inflammation, stellate cell activation, fibrosis. That story needs to be run to ground a bit more.
In truth, stellate cells have different subsets that can be identified by this high-resolution technology, if you'd like. And there was a great basic science lecture right before that session detailing a little bit of that, where you can go single-cell nucleus RNA analysis and actually transcriptome analysis. So you learn about what does each stellate cell do, and there's a number of subsets that you can identify.
I walked away from the meeting and that talk with my own personal initiative to champion the development of a clinical trial paradigm where we can do home health visits. Patients would need to come in, I think, for screening and randomization and end of treatment, but every other visit could be done at the house.
You know what? That was so complete within its range that this is something that never happens, but I don't even have a question for you about that.
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Dr. Stephen Harrison, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guest, hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Professor Jörn Schattenberg, as they discuss some of the major NASH and NAFLD stories of the past 3 months. This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
This is a follow-up to last week's episode and has some similar traits to it. Weather storms, Jewish holidays, illness, scheduled disruptions. So last week, if you recall, what we did was a series of individual one-on-one interviews with Louise and me, talking with Tony Biliati and Wayne Eskridge about the patient perspective, and then Donna Cryer and I doing a one-on-one after Louise had gone off on vacation. Louise is still on vacation, although she did remember to send me a text message reminding me of how well Liverpool and her husband's team Crystal Palace did last weekend. Crystal Palace thrashing Tottenham. So we have Jörn and Stephen with us, and what we're going to do are a few things. First of all, Jörn was a participant and major speaker at last week's Paris NASH conference. We want to talk about that. As I say, normally we try to have 5 people. We only have 3, but I'm betting that between Jörn and Stephen, they can fill up as much airspace as necessary with really high value, high content information. Big challenge, guys. We up to it?
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hear all that confidence, listeners? It's all good. So with that, why don't we just get started? Icebreaker. Best thing, personal and professional, that happened in the last week.
So I'll go first. And I think the clear personal best was, of course, to be able to travel again, meet up with friends and peers, and actually get together to discuss science and progress in the field. That was very energizing to me. It felt very good, and I was fortunate enough to be allowed to go. Of course, we had very much all precautions in place, being very active about vaccination rates and the distance and masks. But with all this in place, it was a great meeting, a lot of fun personally to meet up with colleagues you haven't seen for so long. And then from a meetings perspective, you get so much more out about talking one-on-one or discussing together than you would have out of a Zoom meeting. So I think this has really been a great week, and I would hope that we get slowly back to normal. These things will also help us to advance this.
Okay, Jörn, that's great. Stephen, what you got?
Well, let's see. On a professional side, I would just echo what Jörn said. I was able to travel to the Paris NASH Summit and interact personally with Jörn and Vlad and many of our colleagues who were in attendance. And that was special. It was good to be able to do, I think, what we're really innately wired for, and that is a personal touch, not communication by phone or by Zoom. It wasn't that you couldn't get the content by listening, because many people did, but it was the sidebar conversations, the coffee chat, the smile, the handshake, the warm gesture, the personal touch that I missed, and I've heard from many of my colleagues that they missed that as well. So it was great to be able to travel. Today is Monday. I came back on Friday, so technically I am almost clear and I'm still feeling fine. I don't think I contracted the virus, even though I did not get a third booster shot before I went. On a personal note, I had a great weekend with my daughter at Southern Methodist University. She's a freshman, and it was parents' weekend, and so I got to spend the weekend with her. It was really interesting. She actually is the one that had to pick me up from DFW Airport. She's never done that before. It's always been me Ubering or driving myself, and she's never been to pick me up. So that was a role reversal that was quite interesting to see. And then another personal note, you guys talk about soccer, which is not really football. I talk about football, like the oblong leather ball that's played in the United States. And my alma mater, the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss, is continuing to blow away the competition, albeit not the greatest competition in the world, but we are up to number 17 in the AP and number 16 in the coaches poll nationwide, and setting ourselves up for a battle with number 1 Alabama here in the next 2 weeks. So stay tuned to see how well the Rebels play as we enter Southeastern Conference competition.
Hotty-toddy, Stephen. Hotty-toddy.
Hotty-toddy.
Yeah. I guess my personal best is in the Jewish religion, the time between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is on Wednesday, is a period of reflection and conversations with people and thinking about your last year and what can you do better and seeking forgiveness where necessary and enlightenment wherever possible. And this year, amidst a little bit of illness, a couple of weather emergencies and stuff, I've actually had the time and space to understand the awesome power of the world. I'm not going to put this on a deity necessarily or specific deity, but the awesome power of the world. I've been in storms and floods and all this other garbage and have emerged from it, I think, with a peaceful and contemplative good place that I didn't have 2 weeks ago. Professionally, this podcast continues. Well, I've got that in the business section at the end, but I want to thank people keep signing up, joining up and listening, and all that's good.
Where are we at with that, Roger? Because I don't ever get to listen to the business side of the house. So
I will do this twice then. Pardon me, those of you listening to the back, or just turn it off at the end and don't worry about it. 2 weeks ago, Stephen, was our single biggest download week ever, which is interesting because before that, all our big download weeks had either been conferences or news events. And this was just a week. It was actually the week that Jörn came on and talked about cirrhosis, which was the week after Arun came on and talked about FGF21.
Paradoxically, it didn't happen on a weekend I was off, right?
Only some of it. Only some of it. I was the only one who was here for all 4 weeks. I claim no credit. But we are now averaging over 100 downloads a day for the last month. We've been doing that for the last 10 days. We never hit that number before. The last 4 weeks have been the biggest 4 weeks we ever had. Before that, it had been the 4 weeks ending 2 weeks ago. And we did something that I never thought we'd ever do, which is pod status. They keep these different top lists. And they have a top list for medicine, and they have a top list of health and fitness, and then they have a top list overall. And for a period of 4 days in the middle of last week, week before last, I think it is, we were the number 190 to 197 ranking total podcast in the country of Macedonia. Why Macedonia? Go figure. I mean, you got the TikTokers, and you got the self-helpers, and you got the political crazies on both sides, and you've got everything else in the world, and we wound up on the top 200.
That's terrific.
Those are 4 days that you were on, Stephen. So,
all right.
I bet you're the number one in hepatology. I don't think there's another hepatology webcast.
There isn't. This is it.
Of course, being number one in that would be what they call in American football, a little bit like beating up on the Sisters of the Poor. You're not really playing anybody much, but we'll take it nonetheless. Thank you, Jörn. So that's how the podcast has been doing, Stephen. Hitting charts. And in fact, this week we hit the health and fitness chart in Iceland, which we've never done before. We've been on at least 2 health and fitness charts every day for the last 4 weeks. It's good. People are listening. People are enjoying. We're about to start taking it out to potential sponsors.
Jörn is a rock star in Germany. He probably, if they knew that he was on this podcast, it would shoot up the German charts.
So let's talk about how to promote that appropriately in German language social media environments.
Most people speak English.
Jörn usually starts every lecture he gives with some German phrase. So
I did that, right?
You did.
Yeah, that was Theodor Fontane. Effi Briest, this is a novelist, long gone, and the phrase I used, it's a broad field, it's ein weites Feld, and that was described in that novel because I was talking on AI and patient selection tools that were available, and we've discussed parts of that in this podcast. But of course, there's a lot of things happening. And very recently, 2 very well-phrased reviews in hepatology, so everybody who's still interested or particularly looking for AI, I think this is a good resource these days. this. I believe Mazen did one of those.
First of all, that's a nice bridge from the personal into the professional through a little bit of personal speaking style. Well done, Stephen. Well done, Jörn. First thing we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about Paris NASH conference, which was this past week, as both Jörn and Stephen have noted. And this episode is not going up in 9 days. It's going up literally on Wednesday, so we're trying to keep this current in that regard. Jörn, why don't you take the lead in walking us through session by session? Stephen will comment, and I'll ask questions, and let's see how that goes. So why don't you kick us off?
Yes, well, thanks. I was impressed by the overall program, as I said. I have to say, Rune Sanyal and Lauren Serfati both did an amazing job to pull this together, to have interest for both persons, people meeting in place there, but also the people following online. And I think they mentioned something around 400 to 500 attendees, which I think is a big success for this particular meeting. The first session, which came on Thursday around noon, was Epidemiology and Public Health. And the first speaker, actually Jeff Lazarus, which we had here, detailed some of the aspects we discussed in this podcast previously, the public health response, what is needed, how to do it. Was a good platform to recap that. I don't think we have to go into depth because we had a single episode about it, but it was just good to see him give this talk there and spread the word about this. And then that same session had two very interesting talks to me. The next one was given by Abhijit Banerjee. I think I might have said that wrong. He's a Nobel laureate from the US and a social science professor. And he talked about economic hypotheses and how these could be integrated into phase 3 clinical trials. This is something from the medicine field we're not particularly used to, but the social sciences do this regularly. And they have a lot of confounders they have to control for. In general, it's not even close to what's RCT in medicine, but I just found it's interesting. And I think this is one of the strengths of Paris NASH, that you bring in different views and different science aspects here that could help us to expand the entire field a little bit. And the first session was actually finished up by Vimal Mishra from the US, likewise, and he discussed the paradigms of actually care delivery, which fit in well with Jeff in the beginning because they introduced some automated health system aspects that could also be integrated in the context of AI, namely telemedicine aspects. How do you link rural areas to a specialist clinic? We need a lot more of this if we want to target and treat NASH in the end, because right now, the way I see it, there's a lot of expert knowledge, but that expert knowledge is not existent everywhere where the people are, the patients are, and we really got to develop systems and ways to assess these areas, potentially also rural areas where there's no specialist.
Jörn, did that talk cover anything about rural programs in India, where I know the government is involved and I know Arun is involved and they're doing a ton of work?
Yeah, they had this on later. There's another session. That was on the second day. Somebody from India actually came out. That was a panel discussion towards the end. And he detailed in the Global NASH session number 8, Abhijit Chowdhury from Indore actually joined and discussed what they do in rural India, and the fact that actually India is the first country that came up with a NAFLD policy to be available to treat and identify these patients. So that was very interesting too. That was the end of the second day.
Okay. Stephen, thoughts, comments, questions?
Well, I showed up just a little late for the first one, so I heard the last speaker of that section. He from VCU, right, Jörn? He's a hospitalist that Arun knows and that works there on the wards. And I thought his talk was very apropos, particularly from the perspective that I have in drug development for NASH, because one of the challenges we've had over the past 2 years is enrolling NASH clinical trials and getting patients to come to the clinic to screen, come back and be randomized, come back for their weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly visits, and then complete the study. And in our clinic, we do lots of telehealth visits, but we haven't really moved that over into the clinical trial space. So that's the next frontier. The next frontier is doing remote clinical trial site visits. There's nothing in GCP or the FDA regulations that would prevent that from occurring. It's totally reasonable to do, and we just need to do it. We need to organize as sponsors, as CROs, as sites, as coordinators, and get this done. So I walked away from the meeting and that talk with my own personal initiative to champion the development of a clinical trial paradigm where we can do home health visits. Patients would need to come in, I think, for screening and randomization and end of treatment, but every other visit could be done at the house. We would bring a phlebotomist, we would ship IP, we would assess AEs, and we would manage the patient completely in the comfort of their own home. And I think it's doable. I think it transcends liver disease and gets into every other aspect of clinical trial development for every other specialty. And it's time that it gets done.
Amen to that.
Good point, Stephen. And I can see how that really evolves and fits for some people. Now, I do think there is room for certain visits, maybe not all safety related, but I'm a little bit afraid that you're going to have more dropouts if the personal contact is lost. It's the same as we're not seeing each other in conferences where there's a little bit of a personal link. If you can overcome that by decreasing the number of travels to the study center, for sure, this will be a clear advantage for the patient.
You have to figure out what the sweet spot is between in-person visits and at-home visits. I know when I'm calling patients and talking to them about clinical trials, and I'm in conversation with my sub-investigators who do this routinely, one of the biggest challenges is work schedules, whether or not we live in a COVID era or not. It's how do we work around work schedules? And this would actually increase clinical trial enrollment and maybe even increase participation all the way through and prevent dropouts. Paradoxically, because often when patients drop out, whether this is a real excuse or not, they say they just don't have time to continue to come in for their visits. Their schedule has gotten much busier. Life's taken a turn. Work has gotten much more busy. Whatever it is, if we could offer, hey, no worries. We'll come to the house when it's convenient for you. Even if that's on the weekend. Maybe that makes it easier and more palatable to the patient to continue. And at the end of the day, that's good for the whole field. It's good for every field.
Yeah, so Stephen, look, we know that customer experience is an important positive predictor for anything or any service anybody buys. There's no reason to think this would be different in that regard. That the more hassle you can get out of it, the more positivity you can get into it, the better off you are. I'm intrigued by Jörn's question and your answer, actually, which is there probably is a sweet spot that a couple of things might have to get done in person, although maybe on a much more flexible schedule. I'm kind of sad Louise isn't with us today since Todd was in the business of putting FibroScans on trucks and taking them all over the UK. I'd be interested in her perspective as to whether, in fact, you could take something like FibroScan and make that the thing that you're always bringing to people in real time, given that it always isn't all that frequent. But it gives them feedback, it gives them human contact, or in some other way to just have a couple of events blended in the middle that, as you say, could be done on the weekend or aren't as time sensitive. Cool concept.
Absolutely.
I like it. So with that, why don't we move on to the second session?
Yeah, I don't think I want to go through all of them. Second two was in clinical aspects. So there was some on lean NASH, was a good talk by Monica Sarkar talking about maternal NAFLD and pregnancy. And the one that I found most interesting in that session was actually by Jennifer Lynch from Sweden. They took the UK Biobank data and had the imaging phenotypes of these patients. The data was actually presented previously a little bit different at ASLD, this study that we also discussed where they observed liver fat and intra-abdominal fat and looked at cardiovascular risk. And actually the highest risk category was low liver fat and high visceral fat. And now here they described metabolic phenotypes and their clinical implications, again following up and building on that observation. And bottom line to me comes the idea, and is what they described, that again NASH does come in different flavors and not all patients are created equal. And there are certain subtypes that just using FibroScan or liver biopsy might not be well subsegmented. There's a lot of power in that imaging data. It's expensive and maybe not feasible for clinical trials, but in a research setting, the more data we can get, it'll help us to subsegment the large NASH population. Potentially we'll be able to identify phenotypes.
Yeah, I think this is interesting because they published a paper this year in Liver International with Amelia Gustadelli and Ken Kuzi looking at pioglitazone and its effects on visceral adiposity. And what we know is that visceral fat is not good fat, right? There are two different depots of fat: subcutaneous fat, visceral fat. Subcutaneous fat, fine. From a metabolic standpoint, sub-Q fat, not that big of a deal. May not look pretty, but it's not affecting overall metabolic health. Visceral fat, on the other hand, is highly metabolically active. It's linked to lipid and glucose metabolism. It's also linked to NASH severity and potentially non-hepatic cancers. And we now know that there are drugs that modulate that differently. We talked about pioglitazone, and so you could transcend that to PPAR gammas. But tesamorelin, which is a growth hormone releasing hormone analog that is announced that they're going into phase 3 in NASH, has a pretty big effect on visceral fat. And so there may be these phenotypic expressions of NASH that respond better to different mechanisms of action based on their fat phenotype, if you will. And to Jörn's point, not sure we're to the point where it's ready for prime time or ready to be in every clinic, but it sure brings up an interesting discussion. Does this explain potentially some of the variances in response to therapy that we see across the board? And when we get to the fibrosis section, I'll have more to say on that variance because Scott Friedman brought up some amazing points as well.
You know what? That was so complete within its range that this is something that never happens, but I don't even have a question for you about that. I take that back. I do have one, right?
Yeah, you're usually pretty good about stuff.
Which is sometimes you look at novel data or a novel way of looking at stuff and you say, yeah, in context, even if that point doesn't prove out, there's an underlying truth to it that makes sense. And sometimes you take a look and say, hey, if that point doesn't prove out, it's worthless. Is there an underlying truth here where even if the results of trial did not prove powerful, significant differences, you would say, well, there's an underlying fact here surrounding how we think about maybe something else we've learned about visceral fat or anything like that that would transcend simply what you could produce in a single set of studies?
We're constantly learning about the pathogenesis of this disease and how it fits into the bigger picture of metabolic health in general. And to me, they're so inextricably linked. Liver fat, visceral fat, hepatocyte damage, hepatocellular inflammation, stellate cell activation, fibrosis. That story needs to be run to ground a bit more because there may be therapies that do a really good job of removing visceral fat that maybe we're not focused on in liver disease. I mentioned two, PPAR gammas and growth hormone releasing hormone analogs, but maybe there are others out there that we're not really thinking about that may be applicable.
That's interesting. Somebody, go run a whole bunch of research and see what you can find that might make sense. That's an interesting idea, Stephen. And an awful lot of old drugs get second lives because somebody says something like that, and it turns out that the answer lies therein. PO is not exactly new, for example, although it's not the only one that comes to mind. Shall we move back on through the meeting, Jörn?
Yeah, that brings us to session 3, what Stephen mentioned was one of the fascinating sessions. It was called Deep Dive into Fibrosis and was chaired by Frank Tucker, a colleague from Berlin, and Manuel Romero Gomez didn't make it, so I think this was the one where Stephen jumped in and actually took over the chair. And there was 3 talks, one discussing the histological assessment of fibrosis, innovations in that field by Julian Calderaro from France, then one innovations in imaging assessment and fibrosis, Lars Johansson, and Scott Friedman finished up again giving a fascinating talk on the molecular evolution and also importantly resolution of fibrosis. What do we know about the immune cell type composition? How is this driven? And what can we learn and actually potentially exploit for the best of patients? And I think Stephen shared that session. I'm just going to hand it over to him to maybe highlight from his side, and then I can comment on that.
Sure. So, as Jörn mentioned, 3 talks, one from a pathologist, one from a guy focusing in radiology, and then, of course, Scott Friedman, who is a pioneer in stellate cell mechanism and function. So the first one, entitled Innovations in Histologic Assessment of Fibrosis, I wasn't really sure there was a lot new that came out of that talk, but he said a couple things that I thought were apropos. If it's easy for humans, it's easy for AI. That is really the crux of the entire thing. When we think about artificial intelligence, where we're really making the most advances right now is in fibrosis. It's also the one where pathologists tend to agree the most. Where we're struggling a bit is in ballooning, and that's also where pathologists struggle the most. But at the end of the day, I do think that AI digital pathology will help us reduce variability, increase precision and accuracy, and help us clarify endpoints. At least as long as we're dealing with histology as an endpoint, it will help us a bit in reducing that variability. So where we need to go with that is we need AI to do 2 things. We need to understand from a fully quantitative assessment of whatever we're assessing, and I'm going to just take collagen for right now. We need to understand on this fully quantitative spectrum how much of a change represents a 1-stage change semi-quantitative. Why? Because we can then link it to an outcome. And ultimately, we want AI digital pathology to predict a clinical outcome. And then we want to transition to non-invasive testing. To me, that's how we're setting up these LOIs with the FDA and the biomarker qualification program, is we're saying, for now, we're good being providing a companion diagnostic. We want to come alongside the pathologist and provide additional helpful information that would help ultimately define the true histopathologic grade and stage that we see under the microscope. And in so doing, we'll increase precision, accuracy, and reduce variability. So I thought that was the crux of the discussion. Then I think it gets really interesting. For me, the lecture on imaging, which was Innovations in Imaging Assessment in Fibrosis, was really cutting edge. And there are now ways using MR where we can measure stellate cell volume and we can measure stellate cell activation. And I think that is critical in early stage drug development. If you're an antifibrotic drug, if you think you have antifibrotic activity, then if you do this MRI type of technique, we can assess whether you're downregulating stellate cell activation very quickly within a matter of weeks. So I thought that was very interesting. And then maybe one that's more apropos and maybe more ready for prime time is this idea of MRI plus gadahexate or gadolinium. And GAD is taken up by functional hepatocytes. And so if you begin to lose hepatocyte function, by default, it's not taking up GAD. So MRI plus GAD could be a marker of functional hepatocytes and could predict time to decompensation or liver transplant-free survival. And we talk a lot about HepQuant and some of these other endocyanin green tests and all these functional assays, HVPG. Why not just do MRI with GAD? We're doing MRI-PDFF, we're doing MR elastography, we're getting multi-parametric MRIs. Yes, those are non-invasive, no IV infusion type therapies, but if you're in the scanner, put an IV in, shoot some GAD in, get a functional assessment of what's happening, particularly in a cirrhotic trial. To me, that makes sense. He ended by saying 3D imaging. Now, 3D MR elastography looks very, very promising, not only for distinguishing the F1s from F2s and F2s from F3s, but also in identifying NASH versus no NASH. Now, the problem with MR elastography, at least 2D MR elastography, is it doesn't do a great job of distinguishing the milder stages of fibrosis. It's really good at F4s from F3s, relatively good in F3s from F2s, and then it kind of just all kind of falls apart a little bit. There's not a lot of separation if you look at box plots and confidence intervals between a 1 and a 2, and to some degree a 2 and a 3. So that's where 3D imaging could potentially take us to the next step. Problem is, it's still investigational, and only a few sites in the United States have that technology. And then finally, maybe the most exciting of the entire section was the lecture given by Scott Friedman, and it should come as no surprise because he is a quintessential leader in this field, and every time he opens his mouth, it seems like something new and amazing comes out. And that was no different here today or here at the meeting. And what he told me that in the audience that struck a chord with me and maybe actually took me back a little bit was his comment that different stellate cells may have different patterns of expression. And that becomes important because given the heterogeneity of fibrosis response to various mechanisms of action for NASH treatment, you have to begin to question, is it possible that histologic phenotypes of NASH could be the reason why we have different responses? In other words, are these stellate cells being modified genetically, epigenetically, or with diet and nutrition or lifestyle that make them unresponsive or more responsive to drugs? So are we dealing with two things? Are we dealing with how well the drug works through its mechanism, and then how sensitive a stellate cell is to being modified? And if that's the case, that could be good or bad. We need to understand stellate cell function and its response a little bit more. And that's where the single cell RNA that he spoke so highly of can begin to help us. And anyway, I will end there, maybe ask Jörn to straighten it all out for me, where I was a little rough around the edges. But I think that was a tremendous section.
I agree, Stephen. Well said and well phrased. And I think I'll just follow up with Scott's talk and saying, I think you mentioned that. He highlighted, you said stellate cells again. In truth, stellate cells have different subsets that can be identified by this high-resolution technology, if you'd like. And there was a great basic science lecture right before that session detailing a little bit of that, where you can go single cell nucleus RNA analysis and actually transcriptome analysis. So you learn about what does each stellate cell do, and there's a number of subsets that you can identify. So it might in the end be a ratio of stellate cell subsets that determines where you are in your pathophysiology, how well you just respond to drug, and that makes, of course, the picture a little bit more complex. You could then break it down again to a comment Donna Cryer made, is maybe it doesn't matter what kills you in the end as long as you're dead, so it comes down to a net effect. Diversity, and I agree here with you, Stephen, the diversity of some of the variability we're seeing in response is partially related to that. There are different subsets, and they're not all doing the same thing at the same time. There's probably a dominant aspect, and maybe one day we'll learn to design pharmacotherapy around this.
You're absolutely right. The lecture that preceded this section was a phenomenal lecture and really focused on that novel technology looking at single cell assessment. But I remember that one of the things Scott mentioned is that maybe, is it macrophages that potentially can undergo a transdifferentiation to stellate cells?
You expressed some concern about this, thought about a number of times, and he wasn't truly convinced, was my take-home message.
Gotcha. That was a deep dive into, you want to know where the field's headed, at least in fibrosis and stellate cell biology? That's where it's
To single cell?
Yes.
The power of the tools we're able to apply both in animal models but also translational has just improved by looking at each cell. You get a complete map of the stellate cells, and of course you need AI to integrate this and see what it means. It's not ready to be translated into clinical trials, but hypothesis generating to support novel MOAs discovery, I think this is really a step forward.
So, Jörn and Stephen, when we talk about subsets of stellate cells, are those different steps on a common pathway, or are those fundamentally different cells?
No, this is probably this. I guess now we need Scott on here.
Let me give you the question behind the question, if that helps. When you think about drug development in a whole bunch of areas going back to small molecule 30 and 40 years ago, right? You started with the idea, for example, that there were adrenal blockers, and then you got to alpha 1s and alpha 2s, beta 1s and beta 2s. And every time that you were able to take a cell type and split it, you were able to identify either new, more efficacious targets or ways to fundamentally alter the safety to efficacy ratio of the drug you're talking about. So when you say subsets of stellate cells, I immediately go back to things like that, and I say you can produce much better drugs if you understand what really matters here. On the other hand, if there's stages on a pathway, then that doesn't work the same way, really. So that was the question behind the question.
Bottom line, it comes down to, I think this is a snapshot of a functional assessment of that stellate cell. By using that technology, transcriptomics, what is the cell producing? What is it making? Single cell RNA analysis. They are capable to turn this off and potentially change and go into a different subset. The transdifferentiation that Stephen mentioned is about going into a different cell type, which is a little difficult, and I think this is still not, that debate isn't quite settled. I can't give you a different answer, but I just found it fascinating on how deep we're able to take a look into that.
I think we need to use this as an opportunity to have Scott come on the podcast and do a deeper dive into this fascinating area. This podcast has really grown to the point where it is an avenue to disseminate information, and the work that he's doing is seminal and really critical, and coming on and expounding on that a bit more would be incredibly helpful.
I think that would be great. I mean, and I don't get into this, but I know that's right. I mean, when I do professional best, I don't do things like the people who call me and send me notes and say my whole department, my whole company, my whole whoever loves what you're doing. I've got this nickname as the woman from Surfing NASH because every time fatty liver disease comes up, I talk about what you've been talking about on the podcast. We're starting to get that feedback, if not on a weekly basis, 2 or 3 times a month from somewhere. Big drug companies, major academic institutions, developmental drug companies. So I think that part's right. I think Scott coming on, this stuff is really fascinating because if you take a look at what's 5 years precursory to people really figuring out how to reshape their thinking about drugs and drug development, is usually this kind of thing. Figure out more about the cells and how they go together.
And then we're going to have Jörn come back and talk about all the data he's mining on screen fail.
We'll get into it. That's the next topic.
Next topic for today or for the next podcast?
No, I think that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, I think it probably is. I was afraid you're going to say next topic, and I was looking at the clock and saying, we don't have the 35 minutes it's going to take to do that. You aren't minimally. All right, so anything else about Paris NASH? Okay, so let's collate the second day. Pick out the things that you think really matter.
I know Dr. Ranella gave what I would anticipate would be an incredible presentation on emerging therapies.
She did. And I think a lot of them we've discussed in parts here previously, but she was right on, and it was a great presentation. I actually missed the first session on day 2, which was on the management of obesity by targeting gut hormones, because it's an interesting topic by itself. And the last session, the last talk in that therapeutic advancement session, however, was on endoscopic, bariatric, and metabolic therapies. My take home here was, albeit their effectiveness, there is always a barrier for those endoscopic procedures related to accessibility and reimbursement. And even if you have devices and expertise, one of the challenges is to get this to the patient because they might not be reimbursed or might not have the money to pay for those expenses. If you think beyond pharmacotherapy and lifestyle as a basis, and you want to offer bariatric endoscopic interventions, this is something that needs to be tackled.
Is it inherently likely that you can improve the accessibility by reducing the cost, or do you simply have to get payers and governmental authorities more comfortable with the economic benefit at the end of the story?
That's one thing, but then there's also the experts' needs for placement, so you got to go to special places. The advantage of pharmacotherapy is, of course, that you can do a prescription at a primary care physician's office, and the accessibility is just much higher from pharmacotherapy. So I thought this was something interesting there. But moving on, I think there was another session 6 on the biology. Jelen Aman talked on epigenetic determinants of NASH, and they showed an animal model of physical activity, which I thought was interesting. We did a study like this earlier, and we're able actually to show the intrahepatic immune phenotype shift. So animals that were working out had changes in the epigenetic signatures which were detectable. And then there was a talk on cellular senescence and aging in NASH, also a hot topic, mostly exploited on the basic science aspect at this point. That second day really had another fascinating session number 7 was called Clinical Trial Innovation, and there was some NASH trial design, strengths and weaknesses, some of which we've discussed before, but also discussion on competing risk and risk analysis in NASH. So I think this will be very important. It is every time we come on this podcast and discuss clinical trial data, of course, competing risk analysis is something we got to consider. So I thought that session was also particularly worth mentioning.
The topics are interesting. Any particular wrinkles in the findings that would inform the discussions that we have around here?
Bottom line, Philip Maturin gave that last talk, and he pretty much said that there is a lot of plain analysis of survival curves in NASH. If you think about a heart outcome and mortality, is so difficult because really the attribution of the mortality to the NASH phenotype in the metabolically diseased patient is complex. And you got to be smart and have a good statistical analysis plan to fine-tune what caused that patient has actually died if you look at mortality as an endpoint. And then, of course, the big question is, even if your drugs work, the patient has died, is this related to this endpoint we're seeing here in these analyses? So I think this is difficult and something that needs to be discussed. Stephen, I know you're very experienced also in thinking that through. It's just the Kaplan-Meier survival curves in a NASH outcome trial might not capture all aspects of the drug benefit.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's the entire extrahepatic benefits of certain drugs that may take different time points to show an effect. There's also the PRO piece to this. FDA approves drugs based on how you feel, function, or survive. It's not just survive, right? It's feel and function. So Zubair Younasi talks a lot about the PROs, but that's a critical piece to this. I'm always amazed. People tell me that NASH is asymptomatic, but I'm amazed at how poor their patient-reported outcome measures are at baseline and how they can change significantly with therapy. It's not something we spend a tremendous amount of time on. We tend to focus on survival and some of the more major morbidities that are linked to it, and rightfully so, because that's the approvable endpoint, right? It's decompensation, males greater than 15, progression to cirrhosis, liver transplant, death. So anyway, I do think that thinking broadly is important. That'll come up in combination therapies, trying to select which therapies are best to put together. It's not just about route of administration or managing another drug's side effects with a drug that mitigates those side effects, or the synergies of a drug. It's much more complicated than that, which, by the way, is another thing Scott Friedman loves to talk about. Is we should be not only looking at drugs that make sense together from a route of administration or managing AE profiles or synergy, but also drugs that tend to synergize in the effects that it has on gene expression profiles. And to his point, he thinks we should be assessing these drugs in the lab, assessing, transcriptomics and metabolomic profiles and lipidomics to see what combinations actually make the most sense. But I digress. Maybe we can ask him that when he comes on as well.
Well, so A, we got to get him on, obviously, but B, does that suggest that omic work becomes much more important in preclinical and early stage than we've been giving it credit for so far? Or have we always thought it's that important, we just have better tools to do it now? Or does it come later in the game? Or is there a fourth option?
It's like I've said before here. The efforts we're putting into this space right now are a relative blunt instrument. We're not really getting after it with a surgeon's scalpel and laser focused. And we were reminded by some of the presentations at the Paris NASH Summit that there's a lot more to it than just a drug that moves liver fat or a drug that suppresses stellate cell function. It's much more complicated than that. We will refine our armamentarium as we move along. I've also mentioned it like this. It's like the Wright brothers learning to fly. Jörn and I are working with biplane drugs, essentially, right? Drugs that are going to allow us to take that initial step and save lives and make a difference. But 10 years from now, as Jörn watches his children matriculate through high school, he's going to look back and say, wow, we really have come a long way in understanding NASH and how to modulate the phenotypic expressions of disease over time that make a huge difference. And we'll get to the 5th generation joint strike fighter and F22 for NASH therapy that just doesn't exist today.
I believe so too. I'm looking forward to that day. Anyways, time is maturing. I just wanted to join with you, Roger, if I may. They had a very fine last session too, where they actually called global NASH. And if I just give a glimpse, because it tells us about the size of the problem and the urgent need to move this field forward. They actually got together a number of renowned leaders from all over the world. There was Chowdhury from India. There was Oksana Drabkina from Russia. She's a cardiologist, I think, by training, but did a lot of work related to disease awareness and health literacy. There was Claudia Oliveira from Brazil, Lai Wai from China, Oren Shibolet from Israel, and Gamal Shihab from Egypt. So it was a global community, and all these experienced hepatologists and physicians. I forgot Arun, who joined him, Stanislas Paul from France, and Stefan Zoitzam, who's very close here to me in Frankfurt, actually received a questionnaire, and they went through questions regarding, the number of patients they saw now, what's the rate of, what's the change, does Hep C go down, NASH increasing, and bottom line, every one of them says that NAFLD has pretty much the strongest increase in disease prevalence in all their expert clinics, and coming on strong on the transplant program. So in that last session 8, which was called Global NASH 8, you could feel that the power by which this program enters into the real or the everyday life of those experienced clinicians.
What's interesting there, right, is that should be accompanied by global urgency to treat and to deal differently. But I don't know that NASH has cracked the code as to how to get to the top of the urgency list yet. I don't know exactly why that is. I think part of it is because it feels like a long-term kind of an issue. Part of it is because, and therefore not going to grab as many headlines as COVID will, for example. But yeah, you're right. I mean, you can see the wave. It's a little bit like climate change. You could see it coming for a long time before it got crazy. And nobody paid enough attention until the rivers really ran dry and the fires got nuts, and you had ground temperatures in the Arctic over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and all of a sudden everybody said, my gosh, this is really a problem. Mindful of an old cartoon early in the days of the ecology movement about a guy reading a newspaper headline on the first caption, second one, he's smiling, and he says, oh my God, I thought it said 3 to 5 years. And the headline was, world to experience significant problems in 35 years. 35 years, well, that's way down the pike. Here, you can see it coming, right, and only amplifying. And the challenge is, so what do we do to, not for today, because as you say, time is maturing tonight, but what do we do to increase salience beyond what we're already doing? How do you unlock that key? With that, let's go to wrap up. Okay, really simple wrap up. One takeaway people, you two, because you were there, one takeaway people should have from Paris NASH that should change the way they do what they're doing today. And then one thing to think about for 5-8 years out the horizon. Most important thing.
Maybe it was because I moderated the session. Maybe it's because I paid most attention to that session. I don't know. But I was really struck by the novelty of where we're headed with MR technology and how it has the ability to minimally invasively or non-invasively, get us the answers we're looking for from an NIT perspective. And then, of course, Scott Friedman's data that we talked about, and that whole stellate cell biology piece is so fascinating. And at the end of the day, it is the crux of what we're trying to palliate and work around in all the things we do with moving liver fat and modulating ballooning and inflammation. It ultimately comes down to how do we turn off a stellate cell and how do we heal hepatocytes. And it would be fantastic if we could have Scott on the podcast to expand on that in the near future.
To me, again, the idea of different phenotypes comes up a little bit related to what Stephen said, different stellate cell populations. That's not going to translate into clinics immediately, and we'll see a net effect measured by a fibroscan in a patient. But just to understand this in more depth and be able to design therapy and maybe fine-tune down one subpopulation to, check the balance just a little bit and get a little bit more into fibrosis resolution. This has been the 7th NASH meeting in Paris, and it has really become one of the very specific and focused specialties meetings here, where they summarize what's going to happen and where the field moves. And I think this was just fascinating to be there again. I think I've been at most of them. I believe I missed the first one, but it's one great meeting where really the future of NASH disease research is discussed, and also the urgency that we got to move on this topic has just been, with that last session highlighted again, because the problem's here, it's here to stay, and we need to define something for our patients to be able to manage them.
First of all, Jörn, thanks for a fantastic walk through that meeting, and Stephen for sharing what you walked through and questions and comments you had. As I'm listening to you guys, I go back to my statistics roots, right? Which is a lot of statistics used to be about getting multidimensional measures down to a limited number of dimensions so you can figure out what really matters. But over time, if you can life is 3D. So if you can find a way to do 3D dimensions and then find little niches within and then better clarity on each of those 3 dimensions, you're just going to learn more. Therefore, you're going to solve more. So what I find exciting about all this is that it seems that the theme of virtually everything you mentioned until the last session was about the ability to extract more information and therefore better insights from the liver using tools that weren't available or using them in ways that people hadn't conceptualized. And that's huge and very, very promising. How to do that given the commercial constraints, the economic situation in the world, the hoops that you've got to go through to even get the first generation drugs to market or second generation drugs to market is interesting. But the picture sounds really exciting and the need sounds really great, really vast. Great, not in a good sense. I'm like, wow, that's a great need. I'm excited, but vast, almost immeasurable. And with that, let me thank both of you gents. As I said, we will be back next week, probably to talk a little bit about the NAFLD Summit, which takes place this week, and maybe to talk to a couple of other folks about what they think some of the key findings of summer were. And Stephen, thanks. Jörn, thanks. I'll be back with the business section that Stephen never gets to listen to in just a minute. Welcome to today's business report. Like last week, there's not a lot of new business to report today. Plus, I'm told that saying listener numbers are growing starts to get old if there isn't a breakthrough worth mentioning. So let's see what we got here.
Listener numbers break 2 more barriers.
If you follow our LinkedIn posts or Twitter feed, you probably know by now that we passed 25,000 Buzzsprout downloads last week. We broke another barrier I find more exciting. We are now regularly showing over 100 daily downloads on our rolling 28 and 30-day averages. We achieved that total for the first time 17 days ago, but it's been in place for each of the last 10 days, and I hope to continue for a lot longer than that.
In pod status news, one new country hits the health and fitness charts.
Last week, Macedonia, this week, Iceland. Of course, hitting the health and fitness list for the first time in Iceland is nowhere near as exciting as hitting the overall in Macedonia, but it's a breakthrough worth reporting nonetheless. We've now had 7 different countries where we've hit the health and fitness list within the last 3 months for at least 3 days in a row. For the last 3 weeks, we've consistently placed on health and fitness in at least 2 countries every day. All good. By the way, sadly, we exited the Macedonian overall chart last weekend after a 4-day stay. Pretty cool nonetheless.
Questionnaire moved to the back burner.
Questionnaires have taken another delay due to weather and other priorities. I'm not going to make any more announcements about these until we've posted them. And with that, I want to thank Stephen and Jörn for making certain that 3 people can produce the content of 5 or 6, and to wish Louise a great week sailing on the Isle of Man. Also, thanks to Riverside FM for recording, Buzzsprout for distribution, Dispatch for editing, and of course the surfing crew for making all this real. We will post the next episode covering the NAFLD Summit and perhaps a couple more KOL interviews on Wednesday, September 22nd. Until then, stay safe, surf on, see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.